Friends, in this lecture, we move from the figure of Noah to the figure of Moses, who is the figure in the Quran who is named the most frequently. 136 times we find the name Moses appearing in the Quran. The Quran, in terms of its recounting of the story of Moses, focuses on two episodes. The first is the story of Moses' confrontation with Pharaoh in Egypt. And the second is the story of the disobedience of the Israelites who followed him as they proceed later after leaving Egypt and heading towards the Promised Land. As with the case of Noah, we find that there are important differences between the figure of Moses in the Bible and the figure of Moses in the Quran. We'll start with the case of the confrontation with Pharaoh, and we'll see what sort of differences we find between Bible and Quran. It's important to note that in the Bible, it's Pharaoh's daughter who finds the baby Moses, who had been left in a basket by the Nile River to escape the command of the massacre of the Hebrew children given by Pharaoh. But the daughter of Pharaoh finds him, and indeed we read in Exodus chapter 2, verse 5, "Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent her maid to fetch it." And so indeed we have this story of how the daughter of Pharaoh saves the baby Moses from the murderous decree of her own father. And she later adopts Moses as her own son. Verse 10, "And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter," that is, the mother of Moses was the one who nursed the baby, "and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and the child, Moses, became the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and she named him Moses, for she said, because I drew him out of the water." That's sort of an etymology or an explanation for the name Moses. Well, what about the Quran? What's different when we come with the Quran? Two things change with the Quran. First, the Quran predicts a future conflict that will take place between Moses and Pharaoh. We read in Quran chapter 28, verse 8, "Pharaoh's household picked him up to be an opponent and a sorrow for them." That is, God already predicts that this child, this Moses, will cause sorrow for Pharaoh. This is quite typical of the Quran. Very often it predicts the future, in a manner of speaking. It gives you the end of the story. The second principal difference, and the more important one, between the Quran and the Bible when it comes to the figure of Moses, is that it is not Pharaoh's daughter, but Pharaoh's wife, and thus Pharaoh himself, who adopts Moses. The very next verse, Quran chapter 28, verse 9. Pharaoh's wife said, "An eye's delight for me and for you. Do not kill him. Perhaps he will be useful to us, or we may adopt him as a son." But they did not foresee. Again, this phrase, "but they did not foresee," is sort of ominous. It shows that eventually this child Moses will cause destruction to the house of Pharaoh. Indeed, this scene of adoption sets up a dramatic encounter that would take place, according to what we can reconstruct of the chronology, later on between Moses and Pharaoh. Moses leaves Egypt, he goes to Midian, where he encounters God, and then he returns to Egypt to confront Pharaoh. And there he demands to Pharaoh, we find this in Quran chapter 26, that he let the Israelites go. And Pharaoh responds, this is interesting, Quran chapter 26, verse 18, "Did we not raise you among us as a child, and you stayed among us for many of your years?" Now this simple phrase actually clashes in an interesting way with the logic of the biblical account. In the Bible, Moses flees Egypt after killing a man and learning that Pharaoh wanted to kill him. He only returns to Egypt when he learns that Pharaoh who wanted to kill him has died. Exodus chapter 4, verse 19, "And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead." In other words, what's happened with the Quran is, according to the logic of the Quran, it's the same Pharaoh, the Pharaoh who adopted Moses, whom Moses later on confronts. Why would this be the case? Why would the Quran depart from Exodus, which insists that it's a different Pharaoh, that is, the Pharaoh who was around when Moses was a child, is not the Pharaoh whom Moses later confronts? Well, it seems that we're returning to a theme that's already familiar to us from our lecture on the topic of Noah. That is, that the Quran likes these accounts that have to do with conflicts among family members. That it matters for the Quran that Moses be the adopted son of Pharaoh, because it's a way for the Quran to advance this point, that faith comes before family, that Moses did not obey his father because his father was an unbeliever, and therefore all of the believers should reject unbelieving members of their family. Well, let's move on to the second principal theme of the figure of Moses in the Quran, namely the way that the Israelites rejected him or hesitated to obey him later on after the conflict between Moses and Pharaoh. As for the disobedience of the Israelites, the Quran often makes the point that the particular heavy legal and religious injunctions laid upon the Jews was, in fact, a reaction, a divine reaction to their sinfulness. Indeed, God, according to this logic, has made burdens exceptionally strong or exceptionally heavy for the Israelites or for the Jews because they've been disobedient. Let me give a verse to try to make this a bit clearer. Chapter 4, verse 160. Due to wrongdoing on the part of the Jews, we forbade them good things that used to be lawful for them, and for deterring many from God's path. That is, God has made certain things that would have been lawful prohibited as a sort of punishment for the disobedience, or the wrongdoing of the Jews. Indeed, the Quran accuses the Jews of various sorts of wrongdoings, of killing the prophets, of having closed or uncircumcised hearts, and of misinterpreting the word of God. But the central episode in the story of the wrongdoing of the Israelites or the Jews in the Quran is the case of the golden calf, something we know, of course, from the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible. The Quran in chapter 20 tells the story of how a figure named a Samari, according to our translation, this is the Sumerian, made the golden calf. Of course, this represents a departure from the biblical text. This figure is not found in the Quran, this Samari figure. In any case, even though Aaron implores the Israelites not to worship this golden calf, not to commit the sin of idolatry, they insist on doing so. In one place, Quran chapter 20, verse 91, they declared to him, "We will not give up our devotion to it until Moses returns to us." When Moses does return, he proclaims piously, "Surely your God is God, the one besides whom there is no other God. He comprehends everything in knowledge." In another passage, in chapter 6, or Surah 6, the Quran accuses the Jews of having committed a great sin for having idolized the calf. Quran chapter 7, verse 152, "Those who idolize the calf have incurred wrath from their Lord and humiliation in this life. We thus requite the innovators." Elsewhere, however, the Quran seems to suggest that the Jews were forgiven for this sin, that the Israelites were forgiven. Quran chapter 2, verse 51, "And recall that we appointed for Moses 40 nights. Then you took to worshipping the calf after him, and you turned wicked. Then we pardoned you after that, so that you might be graceful." Thus we see a tension here. On the one hand, the Israelites are punished, even given severe legal or religious restrictions because of their disobedience. They're condemned for worshipping the golden calf. But on the other hand, the Quran seems to say that God has forgiven them for this precise act of disobedience. Indeed, this is something which marks generally the Quran's discourse on Jews and the Israelites. Namely that on the one hand they're condemned, but we find some other passages, some other elements in the Quran which seem to undermine this condemnation. Let me give another example. The Quran elsewhere regularly describes the Jews as a people who have been cursed for their disobedience. This is very strong language. Quran chapter 2, verse 46, but similar to Quran chapter 2, verse 88, in Quran chapter 4, verse 52, we read, "God has cursed them for their disbelief. They do not believe except a little." Again, Quran chapter 5, verse 13, "Because of their breaking their pledge, we cursed them and we made their hearts hard." We're thus faced with the challenge, how to put these verses together with other verses which seem to have a different perspective on the Jews or the Israelites. Indeed, in Quran chapter 2, verse 62, in Quran chapter 5, verse 69, the Quran includes the Jews among the peoples who will be saved, who need have no fear because they will not be sad. In other words, it seems to be including the Jews among those people who will go to paradise. How then can it be, on the one hand, that we have these passages which speak of the Jews as a cursed people, and another passage which speaks of them as a people who seem to be promised paradise? Here, as with other cases, the key is interpretation. Indeed, the diversity of material on the Jews in the Quran leads to a diversity of interpretation today among Muslim scholars.